The cardboard box arrived at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History on a gray March morning, shipped from an estate sale in Richmond, Virginia. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1967, lay dozens of photographs that would soon shake the foundations of how historians understood post-Civil War America. Dr. Catherine Reynolds, a specialist in 19th century photography, had seen thousands of images during her 23 years at the museum, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to discover. The photographs belonged to the Witmore family, prominent tobacco merchants who had built their fortune in the years following the war. Most images showed the typical Victorian poses: stiff-backed patriarchs, women in elaborate dresses, children arranged like porcelain dolls. But one photograph dated June 1889 would become the center of an investigation that would consume Catherine's life for the next 18 months. The photograph measured 8 by 10 inches, mounted on heavy cardboard backing that had survived remarkably well. It showed the Witmore family on the steps of their estate outside Richmond. James Witmore, 42, stood at the center, his hand resting on the shoulder of his wife, Margaret, 38. Their 3 children were arranged before them. The oldest daughter, Elizabeth, 16, stood to the left, her hands folded demurely. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 6 named Alice, sat on the bottom step, and there, in the middle, stood 10-year-old Thomas Witmore, his face serene, his eyes gazing directly at the camera with an unsettling calmness. Catherine had catalogued the photograph, noting the photographer's mark: Henderson and Sons, Richmond. She had documented the clothing styles, the architectural details of the house visible in the background, the quality of the print. Everything appeared normal, historically valuable, but unremarkable. Then she placed the photograph under the digital scanner to create a high-resolution archive copy. The museum's new imaging system could capture details invisible to the naked eye, revealing textures and shadows that traditional scanning missed. As the image appeared on her monitor, Catherine began the routine work of adjusting brightness and contrast to compensate for age-related fading. She increased the exposure slightly, bringing out details in the darker areas of the photograph. That was when she saw it. To the right of Thomas, barely visible in the original print, a shadow fell across the limestone steps. But this shadow did not match any figure in the photograph. It was too tall, too distinct, its edges too sharp to be a photographic artifact or simple light distortion. Catherine leaned closer to the screen, her heart beginning to race. The shadow appeared to be that of a person standing just outside the frame, someone the photographer had deliberately excluded from the composition. But why would someone stand so close to the family during such a formal portrait? And more disturbing, why had this person been positioned directly beside young Thomas? Catherine spent the next hour manipulating the image, applying different filters, adjusting contrast levels, examining every pixel. The shadow became clearer with each adjustment. It showed the unmistakable outline of a human figure, approximately the same height as James Witmore, standing with arms at its sides. The angle of the shadow suggested the person had been standing less than 2 feet from Thomas, close enough to touch the boy. Victorian photography required long exposure times, sometimes 15 to 30 seconds for outdoor shots. Everyone in the frame had to remain perfectly still, which explained the rigid poses typical of the era. But this also meant the shadow could not be from someone who had accidentally wandered into the shot. Whoever cast this shadow had stood motionless throughout the entire exposure, deliberately positioned beside the child while being carefully kept out of the photographer's composition. Catherine's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She called Dr. Marcus Webb, the museum's director of photographic analysis, a man who had worked with crime scene investigators and forensic historians for decades. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood beside her desk, staring at the monitor in silence. He put on his reading glasses, leaned in, pulled back, then leaned in again. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before he spoke. His voice was quiet, measured, but Catherine could hear the tension beneath his professional calm. This was not a mistake, not a double exposure, not a flaw in the negative. Someone had been standing there, beside that child, someone who had been intentionally excluded from this family portrait, and based on the shadow's position and the rigid formality of the scene, Marcus suspected that this was not the only photograph where such shadows appeared. They needed to examine every image in the Witmore collection, and they needed to do it immediately. The Witmore estate had been demolished in 1952 to make way for a shopping center. But the Henrico County Historical Society maintained extensive records of the property and the family who had lived there. Catherine and Marcus drove out to the Society's small building on a drizzly Thursday morning, carrying the photograph in a protective sleeve. The Historical Society's director, an elderly woman named Patricia Thornton, had been expecting them. Patricia had spent 40 years documenting the families of Henrico County, and she knew the Witmore name well. Too well, perhaps, based on the expression that crossed her face when Catherine showed her the photograph. Patricia invited them into her office, a cramped room lined with filing cabinets and banker's boxes filled with documents. She poured coffee from a thermos, her hands steady despite her 76 years, and settled into her chair with the weariness of someone preparing to tell a story she had hoped never to share. The Witmores had been tobacco merchants, Patricia explained, but that was only part of the story. Before the Civil War, they had been slaveholders, operating a plantation with more than 60 enslaved people. After emancipation, the family struggled to maintain their workforce. Many formerly enslaved people fled north or moved to cities, seeking new lives far from the plantations where they had suffered. But James Witmore had found a solution, one that many southern landowners adopted in the years following the war. He had established a convict leasing program, partnering with the state of Virginia to house and employ convicted criminals on his property. The arrangement was presented as progressive, a way to rehabilitate prisoners through honest labor. The reality was far darker. Patricia pulled out a ledger from 1887, its pages filled with names, dates, and notations. The prisoners, almost exclusively black men and boys, were worked from dawn until dusk, subjected to brutal conditions that differed little from slavery itself. They were beaten, starved, and housed in conditions that public health inspectors would later describe as unfit for animals. Thomas Witmore had been 10 years old in 1889, the same age as many of the boys working in his father's fields. Patricia showed Catherine and Marcus a letter written by a county inspector who had visited the property in 1888, 1 year before the photograph was taken. The inspector described seeing children, some as young as 8 years old, laboring under armed supervision. He had filed a complaint, recommending that the contract be terminated and the prisoners relocated to a state facility. But the complaint had been dismissed after James Witmore made a substantial donation to the governor's re-election campaign. The convict leasing program continued for another 8 years. Patricia opened another file, this one containing newspaper clippings from the Richmond Dispatch. In 1897, the Witmore property had been the site of a scandal when 3 prisoners died within a single week, all from what the coroner ruled as natural causes. An investigation had been launched, and while it ultimately cleared James Witmore of criminal wrongdoing, the negative publicity had been enough to end his contract with the state. Catherine studied the photograph again, now understanding what she was seeing. The shadow beside Thomas belonged to someone who had been part of the household, but was not considered part of the family. Someone who had been forced to stand there, motionless, while the photographer captured the Witmores in their prosperity and respectability. The question was, who? Patricia suggested they examine the property records and prisoner logs, which might provide names and details about the people who had lived and worked on the Witmore estate. The Henrico County Courthouse held such records, assuming they had survived the decades. Catherine and Marcus thanked Patricia and drove to the courthouse, where they spent the next 6 hours in the records room, searching through boxes of documents that smelled of mold and decay. They found what they were looking for just before closing time: a ledger from the Virginia Department of Corrections, listing all prisoners leased to the Witmore property between 1885 and 1897. The ledger contained names, ages, alleged crimes, and dates of arrival and departure. Most entries were brief, noting only the most basic information, but some entries included additional notes, and it was these that Catherine focused on. She found several references to prisoners assigned to household duties, working inside the main house rather than in the fields. These individuals were called house servants, a term that barely disguised their true status. One name appeared repeatedly in the notes for 1889, Samuel Pierce, age 32, convicted of theft in 1887, assigned to household duties and personal attendance to the Witmore children. The notation included a chilling detail. Pierce had been tasked with ensuring the children's safety and proper behavior during public appearances and family events. He was, in essence, a guard assigned to watch over the children, including young Thomas. Catherine photographed the page with her phone, her mind racing. If Samuel Pierce had been assigned to attend the children during family events, he would have been present during the portrait session, standing just outside the frame to ensure Thomas remained still and obedient. Tracking down information about Samuel Pierce proved more challenging than Catherine had anticipated. The Virginia Department of Corrections had limited records from the 1880s and 1890s, and what survived was often incomplete or damaged. But Catherine was persistent, and she had resources that most independent researchers lacked. She contacted the Library of Virginia, which maintained an archive of court records from the Reconstruction era. It took 2 weeks, but eventually she received a scanned copy of Samuel Pierce's trial transcript from 1887. The case file was thin, just 12 pages, but it told a devastating story. Samuel Pierce had been 29 years old when he was arrested in Richmond for stealing a pocket watch worth $2. He had pleaded not guilty, claiming he had found the watch on the street and was trying to locate its owner. The trial lasted less than 3 hours. The jury, composed entirely of white men, deliberated for 20 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. The judge sentenced Pierce to 10 years of hard labor. Catherine read the transcript twice, then a third time, her anger building with each pass. The theft of a $2 watch had resulted in a decade of forced labor, 10 years that would be spent working on the Witmore estate under conditions that differed from slavery only in name. She searched for any record of Samuel Pierce after his release, but found nothing. No census records, no marriage certificates, no death certificate. It was as if he had vanished after 1897, when the Witmore contract ended. This was not unusual, Catherine knew. Many men who survived convict leasing simply disappeared from official records, too broken or too traumatized to rebuild their lives in any visible way. But Samuel Pierce's story was about to become visible in a way that no one could have predicted. Catherine decided to expand her search beyond Samuel Pierce and examine the broader context of the Witmore photograph. She returned to the Henrico County Historical Society and asked Patricia if there were any other photographs of the Witmore family in the Society's collection. Patricia disappeared into the back room and returned 15 minutes later carrying a small album bound in cracked leather. The album contained 24 photographs spanning from 1885 to 1895, documenting various aspects of the Witmore family's life. There were images of birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, visits from relatives, and several more formal portraits. Catherine went through the album slowly, examining each photograph with a magnifying glass, and there, in 5 additional photographs, she found the same phenomenon: shadows that did not match any visible figure, shadows positioned near the children, shadows that suggested the presence of someone deliberately excluded from the frame. In one photograph from 1890, the shadow was positioned directly behind Thomas during what appeared to be a garden party. In another, from 1891, 2 shadows flanked the Witmore daughters during a Christmas celebration. These were not accidents or photographic flaws. This was a pattern, a systematic exclusion of the people who had been forced to care for and control the Witmore children. Catherine photographed every image in the album, focusing particularly on those with visible shadows. Back at the museum, she and Marcus used advanced imaging software to analyze the shadows, measuring angles, calculating heights, and determining approximate positions. The results confirmed their suspicions. The shadows belonged to adults positioned as guards or attendants, people whose presence was necessary but whose visibility was unacceptable in photographs meant to project the family's respectability and status. Marcus suggested they consult with a forensic photographer who specialized in historical analysis. He recommended Dr. Linda Chen, a professor at Georgetown University who had worked on several high-profile cases involving the authentication and interpretation of historical photographs. Linda agreed to examine the images, and 2 days later she arrived at the museum with a portable analysis kit that looked like something from a crime scene investigation unit. She spent 6 hours examining the photographs, using specialized lighting, spectral analysis, and digital enhancement techniques that revealed details invisible even to the museum's sophisticated scanners. Linda's conclusion was unequivocal. The shadows were real, cast by people standing just outside the frame during the long exposure times, required for 19th century photography. Based on the angles and proportions, she estimated that at least 3 different individuals had been present during various Witmore family photographs, positioned close to the children but never visible in the final image. The most disturbing finding came from her analysis of the original 1889 photograph. Using a technique called photometric stereo, which uses multiple light sources to reveal surface details, Linda discovered something that had been completely invisible in previous examinations. On the limestone steps, just inches from Thomas Witmore's foot, there was a mark in the stone. It was faint, barely perceptible even under enhancement, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. It was a scuff mark, the kind made by a shoe or boot pressing against stone repeatedly, over time. Someone had stood in that exact spot many times before, so many times that they had worn a mark into the limestone. The discovery of the scuff mark transformed the investigation from an academic curiosity into something more urgent and personal for Catherine. This was no longer just about documenting a historical injustice. It was about recovering the humanity of people who had been deliberately erased from the visual record of their own lives. Catherine began reaching out to genealogical societies, churches, and community organizations in Richmond's historically black neighborhoods, asking if anyone had family stories or records related to Samuel Pierce or the Witmore estate. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, she received more than 30 emails and phone calls from people who had ancestors who had worked on the property, either as formerly enslaved people before the war or as convict laborers afterward. One message stood out, an email from a man named David Pierce who lived in Philadelphia and claimed to be Samuel Pierce's great-grandson. Catherine called him immediately. David Pierce was 68 years old, a retired postal worker who had spent years researching his family history. His great-grandfather Samuel had indeed been leased to the Witmore estate, David confirmed, and family stories had been passed down through generations about the brutal conditions there. Samuel had survived his 10-year sentence, David explained, but he had never fully recovered from the experience. He had moved to Philadelphia in 1898, married, and worked as a janitor until his death in 1924. He had rarely spoken about his time on the Witmore property, and when he did, his stories were fragmented, colored by trauma and reluctance to revisit painful memories. But there was one story Samuel had told repeatedly, a story that David's grandmother had shared with him when he was young. Samuel had been assigned to watch over Thomas Witmore, to stand nearby during family gatherings and ensure the boy behaved appropriately. The Witmores had been obsessed with presenting a perfect image to Richmond society, and they could not risk their children misbehaving during important events. Samuel had been forced to stand just outside the camera's view during family portraits, close enough to intervene if Thomas moved or spoke out of turn, but hidden from the photograph so that the family would appear unencumbered by the presence of their convict labor force. David had always wondered if any photographic evidence existed of his great-grandfather's time with the Witmores. Catherine told him about the shadows, about the mark on the limestone steps, about the systematic erasure that had hidden Samuel Pierce and others like him from historical view. There was a long silence on the phone, and when David spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. He had spent his entire adult life trying to piece together his family's history, trying to understand the trauma that had been passed down through generations like a dark inheritance. And now, finally, there was proof, tangible evidence that his great-grandfather had existed, had suffered, had stood in that exact spot while the Witmores posed for their portrait of prosperity. Catherine arranged for David to visit the museum the following week. She wanted him to see the photographs, to witness firsthand the shadow that was likely his great-grandfather. When David arrived, he brought with him a small cardboard box containing the few possessions that had survived from Samuel Pierce's life. There was a Bible with Samuel's name inscribed on the first page, a pocket watch that he had purchased in Philadelphia after his release, and a single photograph. The photograph showed Samuel in his later years, probably in his 50s, standing in front of a brick building in Philadelphia. He was wearing a simple suit and a hat, his face weathered but dignified. Catherine placed the photograph beside the enhanced image of the 1889 Witmore portrait, the one that showed the shadow beside Thomas. They could not see Samuel's face in the shadow, of course, but knowing he had been there, that he had stood in that spot while being deliberately erased, gave the shadow a weight and presence it had not possessed before. David stared at the images for a long time, his hands resting on the edge of Catherine's desk. He spoke quietly about his great-grandfather, about the stories that had shaped his family's understanding of their past. Samuel had told his children that he had been invisible during those years, that the Witmores had looked through him as if he did not exist, as if he was nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. And here was the proof of that invisibility, captured in a photograph that was meant to celebrate the Witmore family's status, while erasing the people whose labor had made that status possible. Catherine asked David if he would be willing to participate in an exhibition the museum was planning, one that would explore the hidden histories revealed by photographic analysis. David agreed immediately. This was what his great-grandfather would have wanted, he said. To be seen, to be acknowledged, to have his existence and his suffering recognized by the world that had tried so hard to forget him. The exhibition opened 6 months later in the museum's main gallery, occupying a space usually reserved for more conventional historical displays. Catherine and her team had worked tirelessly to create something that would honor the people whose shadows had been erased from history, while educating the public about the brutal realities of convict leasing in the post-Civil War South. The centerpiece was the original 1889 Witmore photograph, displayed alongside the enhanced digital version that revealed Samuel Pierce's shadow with startling clarity. Beside it hung the photograph of Samuel in his later years, the one David Pierce had brought from Philadelphia. The juxtaposition was powerful, the invisible man made visible, the shadow given substance and identity. The exhibition included detailed explanations of the photographic analysis techniques used to reveal the hidden figures, complete with diagrams showing how angle and light calculations had confirmed the presence of people standing just outside the frame. But Catherine knew that technical details alone would not convey the human cost of what she had discovered. The exhibition needed to tell Samuel Pierce's story, and the stories of countless others who had been subjected to convict leasing's brutality. She had worked with David Pierce to create a biographical panel that traced Samuel's life from his arrest in 1887 through his years on the Witmore estate to his eventual move to Philadelphia. The panel included excerpts from his trial transcript showing how a minor theft charge had resulted in a decade of forced labor. It also featured quotes from letters Samuel had written to his sister during his imprisonment, letters that David had preserved in the family's collection. In one letter from 1889, written just months after the photograph was taken, Samuel described standing beside Thomas Witmore during a family portrait session. He wrote about the physical pain of remaining motionless for the long exposure time, about the humiliation of being treated as invisible while being constantly watched. The exhibition also contextualized the Witmore case within the broader history of convict leasing, a system that had ensnared tens of thousands of African Americans in the decades following emancipation. Catherine had partnered with several other historians to create panels explaining how Southern states had used deliberately vague laws against vagrancy, loitering, and petty theft to arrest black men and boys, then leased them to private companies and landowners who worked them under conditions indistinguishable from slavery. The system had generated enormous profits for both the states and the lessees, while devastating black communities and families. Statistics showed that mortality rates among convict laborers often exceeded 50%, with death caused by overwork, malnutrition, disease, and violence. The exhibition included photographs and documents from other convict leasing operations across the South, demonstrating that the Witmore property was not an isolated case, but part of a systematic exploitation. The opening night drew more than 300 people, including journalists, historians, community activists, and descendants of people who had been subjected to convict leasing. David Pierce attended with his entire family, 3 generations gathered to witness the recognition of their ancestors' suffering and survival. Catherine watched as David stood before the photographs, his grandchildren beside him, explaining who Samuel Pierce had been and what he had endured. The children asked questions, their young voices carrying through the gallery. Why did they make him invisible? Why did they treat him so badly? What happened to him after? David answered each question patiently, translating the complex history into terms they could understand. Catherine felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This exhibition was not just about the past. It was about ensuring that stories like Samuel Pierce's were not forgotten, that the shadows cast by injustice were brought into the light. The exhibition generated significant media attention. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the discovery, focusing on both the technical aspects of the photographic analysis and the human stories revealed by that analysis. Television news programs featured segments showing the before and after images of the Witmore photograph, with reporters explaining how advanced technology had uncovered truths that had been hidden for more than a century. But not everyone welcomed the exhibition or its revelations. Catherine received several angry letters and emails from people who claimed she was distorting history or attacking the Witmore family unfairly. One letter, written by someone claiming to be a Witmore descendant, accused Catherine of engaging in historical revisionism and demanded the exhibition be closed. Catherine responded to each letter professionally, explaining that the exhibition was based on extensive documentary research and forensic analysis, that the facts presented were supported by multiple sources, including court records, prisoner logs, and contemporary newspaper accounts. The controversy surrounding the exhibition brought unexpected attention from academic and legal circles. Several law schools invited Catherine to speak about the intersection of historical research and contemporary discussions of criminal justice reform. She found herself presenting to audiences of law students, judges, and policymakers, explaining how the convict leasing system had established patterns of racial discrimination and mass incarceration that persisted into the present day. The connection between past and present was not abstract or theoretical. It was documented in laws, court decisions, and institutional practices that continued to disproportionately impact black communities. Catherine's presentations included data showing how the arrest and conviction rates for black Americans remained vastly higher than for white Americans, particularly for minor offenses similar to the one that had imprisoned Samuel Pierce. She showed how the economic incentives that had driven convict leasing still existed in modern forms through private prisons and prison labor programs. One presentation at the University of Virginia School of Law proved particularly significant. In the audience was Professor Michael Chen, a specialist in criminal justice reform who had spent years advocating for changes to sentencing laws and prison conditions. After Catherine's talk, Michael approached her with a proposal. He wanted to use the Witmore case as the foundation for a broader research project, examining the genealogy of mass incarceration, tracing the legal and institutional continuities between convict leasing and modern criminal justice practices. Catherine agreed immediately, recognizing that this partnership could amplify the impact of her work beyond the museum's walls. Over the following months, Catherine and Michael assembled a research team that included historians, legal scholars, sociologists, and data scientists. Their goal was ambitious: to document the systemic nature of post-Civil War criminal justice practices and demonstrate how those practices had evolved into modern forms while maintaining their fundamental character of racial control and economic exploitation. The research team began by expanding the photographic analysis Catherine had pioneered with the Witmore collection. They contacted museums, historical societies, and archives across the South, asking if they possessed similar family photographs from the late 19th century. The response exceeded their expectations. More than 40 institutions reported having photographs that showed unexplained shadows or other evidence of hidden figures. The team developed a standardized protocol for analyzing these images, using the same techniques Linda Chen had applied to the Witmore photographs. Over the next year, they examined more than 200 photographs and found shadow figures in 73 of them. Each discovery led to archival research aimed at identifying the hidden individuals and documenting their experiences. In some cases, they succeeded in finding names and biographical details. In others, the people remained anonymous, their identities lost to time and deliberate erasure. The project's most significant finding came from an unexpected source. While researching property records in Alabama, a team member discovered a photographer's business ledger from 1892. The ledger contained detailed notes about individual portrait sessions, including special instructions from clients about how to position subjects and what to include or exclude from the frame. One entry stood out, a note about a portrait session for the Harrison family of Montgomery, with explicit instructions to position the family's convict laborers outside the camera's view while ensuring they remained close enough to maintain control over the children. The note concluded with a chilling observation. Clients appreciated being able to display their respectability without revealing the methods by which that respectability was maintained. This single ledger entry confirmed what Catherine had suspected. The erasure of convict laborers from family photographs was not accidental but deliberate, a conscious strategy for managing the visual representation of families who profited from forced labor. The research team's findings were published in a comprehensive report that received widespread attention in both academic and mainstream media. The report documented the systematic nature of photographic erasure, analyzed the legal and economic structures that had sustained convict leasing, and drew explicit connections to contemporary criminal justice practices. It included a database of identified individuals who had been hidden in photographs, providing names, biographical details, and descendants' contact information when available. The report also made specific policy recommendations, calling for reforms to sentencing laws, the elimination of private prisons, fair compensation for prison labor, and the establishment of a national truth and reconciliation process to acknowledge and address the legacy of convict leasing. Several states responded by forming commissions to study the issue and consider implementing the recommendations. For Thomas Witmore, the boy in the original photograph, Catherine's research uncovered a troubling trajectory that complicated simplistic narratives of innocence and guilt. Thomas had been 10 years old when Samuel Pierce stood beside him during that 1889 portrait session, too young to be held responsible for the system his father had created. But Thomas had not remained a child. Catherine found records showing that he had inherited the family business after James Witmore's death in 1902. By then, convict leasing had ended on the Witmore property, but Thomas had maintained the family's economic interests through other means. He had invested in textile mills that employed child laborers under dangerous conditions, served on the board of a bank that systematically denied loans to black applicants, and supported political candidates who advocated for segregation and disenfranchisement. Thomas Witmore had died in 1941, a respected member of Richmond society, his obituary praising his business acumen and philanthropic contributions. The complexity of Thomas Witmore's life raised difficult questions about complicity, responsibility, and the transmission of injustice across generations. Catherine struggled with how to present this information in the exhibition without oversimplifying the moral dimensions involved. She consulted with ethicists, historians, and community members, seeking guidance on how to acknowledge Thomas's childhood innocence, while also documenting his adult choices. The solution came from an unexpected conversation with David Pierce, who suggested that the exhibition should not focus on assigning individual blame, but on illuminating systemic patterns that shaped choices and constrained possibilities. Thomas Witmore had inherited not just wealth, but a worldview, a set of assumptions about race and power that were embedded in the social and economic structures of his time. Understanding his life required acknowledging both the constraints he faced and the agency he exercised within those constraints. Catherine added a new section to the exhibition, exploring the generational transmission of both trauma and privilege. One panel examined how children of convict laborers carried the psychological and economic impacts of their parents' experiences, how families were disrupted, and communities destabilized by the systematic imprisonment of black men. Another panel examined how white children who grew up in households sustained by convict labor inherited assumptions about racial hierarchy and entitlement, assumptions that shaped their adult lives and decisions. The exhibition included photographs of Thomas Witmore at various stages of his life, as a boy in the 1889 portrait, as a young man taking over the family business, as a middle-aged civic leader. Each photograph was accompanied by contextual information about the broader historical moment and Thomas's specific choices and actions. The presentation avoided both demonization and exoneration, instead offering a nuanced portrait of a life shaped by and contributing to systemic injustice. The response to this section of the exhibition was mixed. Some visitors appreciated the complexity and nuance, the refusal to reduce history to simple moral categories. Others felt it gave Thomas Witmore too much sympathy, that acknowledging the constraints he faced minimized his responsibility for the harm he had caused. Catherine listened to these criticisms seriously, recognizing that there was no perfect way to present such difficult material. She organized a series of public programs where visitors could discuss their reactions to the exhibition, share their own family histories, and grapple with questions about responsibility, complicity, and reconciliation. These programs drew diverse audiences, and the conversations were often intense and emotional. People whose ancestors had been enslaved or subjected to convict leasing sat in the same room with people whose ancestors had been slaveholders or convict lessees. The discussions were not always comfortable, but they were necessary. One program featured a panel discussion with descendants from both sides of the convict leasing system. David Pierce participated, along with 3 others whose ancestors had been imprisoned on various properties across the South. Also on the panel were 2 individuals whose ancestors had operated convict leasing enterprises, including a woman whose great-grandfather had been a major contractor in Georgia. The conversation was remarkable for its honesty and depth. The descendants of lessees spoke about their own processes of discovering their families' histories, about the shame and confusion that accompanied that discovery, about their efforts to understand how their ancestors had participated in such a brutal system. They did not make excuses or seek absolution, but they did speak about the importance of acknowledgement and the responsibility they felt to ensure such systems never returned. The descendants of convict laborers spoke about the ongoing impacts of that history on their families and communities, about the need for concrete remedies rather than just symbolic recognition. 2 years after the exhibition opened, Catherine received a phone call that would bring the project full circle in an unexpected way. The caller identified himself as James Witmore IV, great-grandson of the man who had operated the convict leasing program on the Richmond estate. James was 47 years old, a corporate attorney living in Chicago, and he had recently learned about the exhibition through a family member. He wanted to meet with Catherine and David Pierce, to acknowledge his family's history, and to discuss how he might contribute to efforts addressing that history's ongoing legacy. Catherine arranged a meeting at the museum, and on a cold November morning, James Witmore and David Pierce sat down together in Catherine's office. The conversation began awkwardly, both men uncertain how to navigate the weight of their shared history. But gradually, as they talked about their families, about the exhibition, about their own struggles to understand the past, a connection emerged. James spoke about his shock at learning the full truth about his great-grandfather's business practices. He had grown up hearing family stories that portrayed James Witmore I as a successful entrepreneur who had rebuilt the family's fortune after the Civil War. But those stories had never mentioned convict leasing or the conditions under which that fortune had been accumulated. Discovering the truth had been devastating, forcing James to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his family's history and his own inherited privileges. David listened carefully, then shared his own family's stories about Samuel Pierce, about the trauma that had been passed down through generations, about the strength and resilience that had allowed his family to survive and eventually thrive. The 2 men talked for more than 3 hours, and by the end of the conversation, they had agreed to work together on establishing a foundation dedicated to criminal justice reform and support for families affected by mass incarceration. The Witmore Pierce Foundation launched 6 months later, with substantial funding from James and financial support from several other families whose ancestors had been involved in convict leasing. The Foundation's mission was explicitly reparative, acknowledging historical injustices and working to address their contemporary manifestations. It provided scholarships for descendants of convict laborers, funded legal aid organizations working on criminal justice reform, supported historical research and education projects, and advocated for policy changes at local, state, and national levels. David Pierce served on the Foundation's board, ensuring that descendants of convict laborers had direct input into the organization's priorities and strategies. The Foundation quickly became a model for how institutions and families could move beyond acknowledgement to meaningful action, demonstrating that historical reckoning required not just remembering but also repair. Catherine's role in the story gradually shifted from researcher to curator of an ongoing process of historical recovery and reconciliation. The exhibition became permanent, and the museum established a research center dedicated to documenting hidden histories through photographic analysis and archival research. The center received inquiries from around the world, from people who had discovered mysterious elements in family photographs, from communities seeking to recover erased histories, from institutions working to confront their own complicity in historical injustices. Catherine trained other researchers in the analytical techniques she had developed, building a network of scholars committed to making visible what had been deliberately hidden. She also worked with descendant communities to ensure that recovered histories were presented in ways that honored the dignity and complexity of the people whose lives had been documented in those photographs. The shadow beside the boy in the 1889 photograph had become a window into a vast landscape of hidden history, a single piece of evidence that had opened pathways to understanding and action. Samuel Pierce's shadow, once invisible, now stood as a testament to the persistence of truth and the possibility of recognition even across the gulf of more than a century. The photograph that had arrived in a cardboard box from an estate sale had become something far more significant. Proof that erasure is never complete, that evidence survives, that the past continues to speak to those willing to listen. Catherine often thought about the moment she had first seen that shadow on her computer screen, the instant when Samuel Pierce had become visible after so many years of invisibility. That moment had changed her life and the lives of everyone touched by the subsequent research and activism. It had demonstrated that history is not fixed or settled, that new discoveries can reshape understanding, and that the work of justice requires constant attention to what has been hidden, denied, or forgotten. The story of the shadow beside the boy would continue to unfold in ways Catherine could not predict. As more photographs were analyzed, more names recovered, more connections drawn between past and present, but the fundamental truth remained constant. Those who had been deliberately erased from the historical record deserved to be seen, named, and remembered. Their shadows had waited more than a century to be recognized. Now finally they stood in the light. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.